Cool.
Hi, everyone. So excited to welcome you to a lunchtime seminar with Jack Harley. Jack has been working at the Oxford Society for Longevity and Aging, and he'll be speaking to us today about why we ought to be taking it more seriously as a potential EA cause area. So Jack, please take it away.
Thanks, Aaron. Can you all hear me okay? Yep, cool. So this talk is titled Aging, the Science and Ethics of Solving the World's #1 Killer. This is just a bit about me. My background is in clinical neuroscience at University of Oxford. I also work for a US-based biotech company developing an Alzheimer's drug therapy. And here are some of my other affiliations. And the other kind of affiliation that I have, which I'll talk a bit more about a bit later in the presentation, is this longevity wiki that we're building, which is basically an open access longevity education platform. So I'll tell you a bit about that at the end of the talk. So I just want to kind of start the talk by, I guess, bringing to the fore what we mean when we talk about aging. We're really talking about this biological process that turns a fine young man like Prince Philip here into this decaying old, person who, and as we all know, Prince Philip unfortunately passed away recently. So, aging may seem very abstract to a lot of us when we think about aging, but, it's a very real and a very physical and a very tangible process. And so when we think about anti-aging, we're thinking about modulating or modifying this biological process that would otherwise turn young, healthy, fit individuals into, frail, old, and sick individuals who have a much higher mortality risk. A bit about aging and COVID. We know that COVID mortality exponentially increases with age. And this is why some papers, such as these authors in this journal, Aging Cell, they argue that basically COVID-19 is an emerging disease of aging, which means that it basically follows the same sort of trajectory that other age-related diseases such as diabetes and cancer follow, in that older people have a much higher chance of dying. So while COVID-19 is obviously an infectious disease rather than an NCD and a non-communicable disease, it does follow the same trajectory in having this exponentially increasing case fatality rate, CFR, with age. And you can see that as an 80-year-old, your risk of dying of COVID is over 1,000 times that of someone who's of a younger age. And I think when we think about COVID, this kind of stuff is not always emphasized, but it's always worth having in the back of our mind that if we take aging out of the equation, COVID is no longer a pandemic, okay? People do get infected, people do die, but death rates are up to 1,000-fold lower in those demographics. So we have to consider how big a factor aging is, not only for non-communicable diseases like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, but also communicable diseases such as COVID. So you probably are aware of what is EA, doing the most good. And we think of EA cause areas as animal welfare, AI safety, biosecurity risks, global poverty, and that kind of thing. And in fact, polling from Rethink Priorities suggests that these are kind of what EAs consider the most important cause area, so long-term future, global poverty, etc. But I'm going to make the case that I think aging research is potentially one of the most high impact cause areas. So let's start off with some of the basics of what is aging. Let's begin by differentiating between biological age and chronological age. So biological age is an accurate measure of your position across your lifespan, which is basically, you can think of it as your true biological age, which predicts your mortality. Chronological age is simply the numbers since you were born. So two people might be 50 years old, but one person may have a healthy lifestyle and they may have a biological age of 40, which means they have the same kind of aging trajectory and mortality risk over time as a 40-year-old. Whereas another person, if they've smoked and they've had a sedentary lifestyle and so on, they may have a biological age of 60, which means they have an increased predisposition to die, which is above that of someone of their chronological age. So David Sinclair, who's a Harvard professor who works in this field of aging and anti-aging research, his chronological age is 53, but his biological age is 37. And that's basically predicted and measured using some of these sort of aging clocks. So the aging clocks that are being developed today, they use kind of a range of functional and epigenetic and various forms of data to create a biological aging signature, which uses machine learning to basically like inform you of what your equivalent biological age is. And this is really crucial for tracking aging. And when we have anti-aging therapies that we're trying to develop, it's crucial to be able to measure the aging process so that we can basically ascertain whether the anti-aging therapy has been effective or not. So that's the importance of these aging clocks or these biomarkers of aging. So just as an analogy of what aging is, it's kind of similar to the degradation of a pyramid in the sense that it's a drift away from, in the sense that multiple different processes can result in a shift away from a certain state, okay? So it's sort of, aging is sort of a gradual drift away from a state of health through different cellular mechanisms. And it's comparable to how a pyramid can degrade through erosion or through the theft of stones. And I'll show you what those kind of cellular mechanisms are. Basically, broadly, there's 9 types of cellular mechanisms that comprise the aging process. Some of them you may have heard more about than others. So probably you're familiar that your telomere is shortened. That's called telomere attrition. And you may be aware that, you know, if you get too much sun or just as a result of normal metabolism, you have genomic instability. So you have mutations and other alterations. But there are only 2 of these kind of 9 broad processes. You know, your mitochondria, which are sort of, you know, the energy sources of your cells, they become dysfunctional. You have an increase of senescent cells, which are these death-resistant pro-inflammatory cells. You have reduced stem cells, which is why elderly people shrink, because, you know, their bone marrow doesn't produce the stem cells to regenerate their tissues of their body, and so on. So we know basically that aging can broadly be categorized as having these 9 hallmarks as they're defined. And the kind of landmark paper on this topic is called The Hallmarks of Aging. It has over 7,500 academic citations, and it's the most highly cited academic paper in the aging research field in the last 10 years. So this kind of framework was developed in 2013 and is now kind of the gold standard of like paradigms to think about aging, is the hallmarks of aging. This is just demonstrating the hallmarks of aging in a kind of diagram showing that some are intercellular, some are extracellular. And I'll provide these slides at the end if you want to kind of dig deeper, but you can see that, you know, you have instability of the genome, you have changes to the epigenome, which is basically the kind of methylation tags that kind of control gene expression. And then you also have loss of proteostasis, which means the balance of proteins within your cells are being altered. You have mitochondrial dysfunction, decreased numbers of stem cells, increased senescent cells, and increased inflammation and other changes to intercellular communication. So these are all things that occur with age and are part of the causal pathway of the diseases that kill most people: heart disease, cancer, diabetes, dementias, and so on. So this slide is just to illustrate that aging is actually not implied by the second law of thermodynamics and entropy. And that's because the human body is an open system. So in the same way that if you take a fence and you leave it long enough, it'll decay. But if you add energy to the fence, because it's an open system, which means you can in physics terms, you can do work on the system, you can add energy and matter to the system, you can restore the fence. And the human body is not a closed system, which means that it's not bound inevitably to increase in entropy, which is the state of randomness and disorder. We can bring it to a state of lower entropy. And that's what we're doing with the anti-aging therapies, essentially. Okay, so let's talk about why aging is a problem. Well, this is what I call the scary graph, but it's formally known as the Gompertz-Mackenham law of mortality, which basically shows you that your chance of dying doubles every 8 years past the age of 30. So this is a logarithmic scale, which means that this is really an exponential curve. And this is because of aging. It's because you have this breakdown of your organ systems, which makes you a lot more vulnerable to dying of many different causes. And aging is extremely efficient at killing us. You can see all the leading causes of death: cancer, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, lung disorders. You can see that, when you're about 30 and below, you don't have a very high chance of dying of these conditions. And this is the mortality per 100,000 population. Very few people of this age group would die. But as you start increasing in age, you have this exponentially increasing risk of dying of these conditions. And that's because aging is like this driving force of degeneration, which makes you vulnerable to all of these kind of conditions. And we can go into some of the nitty-gritty of how the hallmarks of aging are connected to some of the diseases, if you wish. But aging is responsible for 70% of all deaths worldwide. So it's more than double all other causes of death combined. The number of people that aging kills per day is 100,000. It's actually more than 100,000. So this is Melbourne, where I'm from originally in Australia. This is our largest sporting arena, the MCG, and it has a capacity of 100,000. So you imagine a full stadium. This stadium here isn't even full, but if the stadium was completely full, that's how many people die per day of age-related diseases, which are driven by aging. But aging not only causes huge amounts of death, but also huge amounts of suffering. In fact, aging is the single largest cause of suffering worldwide, and it contributes 30% of all disability-adjusted life years. Disability-adjusted life years lost. And this is because it's increasing rates of cancer, dementia, frailty, depression, and anxiety, all of which have a big impact upon your quality of life. This is just a visualization of that data that I described on the previous page, and you can view it. Here. So basically, if you aggregate all of the age-related DALYs, it comes out to 30% of all DALYs. So it's the single largest source of human suffering. Just to, because my background is in clinical neuroscience, I'm always interested in, how does it affect your mental well-being? And unfortunately, the highest rates of depression globally are amongst the elderly. So this is data taken from around the world, and you can view the sources here. You can see that the rate of depression in those who are above 50 is almost double that of, almost more than double that of other age groups. So you can see that there's a clear, link between a person's age and their predisposition for depression. And I mean, that makes sense when we consider that, neurodegeneration is kind of this inevitable part of aging. And there is a strong comorbidity with depression and anxiety with neurodegeneration. Okay, so this slide is just showing that we're on track for an aging population. So not only is this currently a huge problem, but it's going to become an even bigger problem once we consider that soon we're going to have over 2 billion people over the age of 60. Now, whether we have anti-aging therapies or not will determine whether these people are biologically young and healthy, or whether they're not biologically young and sick and suffering. So this is just to put into perspective how big of an issue this aging problem is. And because of the demographic shifts that we're seeing globally, this is why it's such a crucial issue. This is just in the US, and you can see that we're currently experiencing this very steep trajectory in the kind of aging population, because the baby boomers are turning old, becoming old, and that's why there's this rapid increase in this kind of 2-decade period, in which there's kind of a really rapid increase in elderly individuals. And the reason this is important also from an economic standpoint is because it affects the global dependency ratios. So the dependency ratios is the number of people under 15 plus the number of people over 65 as a proportion or as a percentage of the entire population. And the higher those ratios are, the more pressure the rest of society who are of working age are put to basically provide for the rest of society in terms of their labor output and economically supporting the rest of society through welfare and so on. And so you can see that all around the world, this is becoming a bigger problem, and it's expected to become an even greater problem over time. Basically, as we experience these sort of aging populations. Now, economically, aging is an immense expense for the world. because of the huge cost, like the inordinate cost of managing these age-related conditions. So dementia is close to $1 trillion, CBD is close to $1 trillion. So you can see that like the world is spending trillions of dollars trying to manage these conditions. But with anti-aging, remember that we're basically nipping things in the bud, and we're basically treating things upstream and preventing people and preventing that exponential rise in these age-related conditions. So the economic benefits of treating the aging process preventatively through anti-aging therapies is enormous. So just as an analogy, you can think of it as the mythical Hydra. You have aging, which is like the driving force of all of these different conditions. And in society at the moment, in modern medicine, we treat the disease of aging, but we don't treat aging itself, even though the diseases of aging obviously are driven by aging itself. Okay, so this kind of relates to Tauber's paradox, which is that if you cure an illness, it should result in fewer deaths overall. For example, if we were to cure cancer, we would expect intuitively that, oh, we've saved some lives. But actually, due to aging, those people will still die anyway of something else. If you cure cancer, studies have shown that if you were to cure every single form of cancer tomorrow, average life expectancy globally would only increase by 2 years. Why is that? It's because if you don't cure aging, you will just die of something else. You'll die of heart disease or diabetes or something else. So unless you're targeting the breakdown of the human body, which predisposes to not only cancer, but all of the disease of aging, then you're going to have this situation where your intervention is not actually extending healthy human lifespan, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here. Okay, so let's focus more on the positive side of things, which is the anti-aging. So right off the bat, we can extend healthy lifespan in mice by up to 30%. So anti-aging is not science fiction anymore. Mammals, such as mice and even primates in some cases, we can give them therapies and they live healthier for longer. Okay, and several of these therapies are now in clinical trials in humans. So there's about 5 or 6 different human clinical trials for senolytics, which are drugs that kill senescent cells, which you may recall are one of the hallmarks of aging. Rapamycin is being assessed in the PEARL study, which is a clinical trial being run in the US. I think it was $600,000 trial. And there's many other kind of therapies that are in the pipeline that are currently being evaluated. So basically, if we think conceptually about what we're doing, rather than waiting until pathology, which is disease, right, and trying to use a geriatric medicine approach, so trying to manage people who have cancer or manage people who have diabetes, we're trying to basically slow the rate of damage as it occurs, okay? This is basically, you can think of it as an engineering approach or like a damage repair approach or a geroscience approach. These terms are all fairly synonymous, but basically it just means instead of allowing a healthy person to become sick and then treating them, we intervene in between to keep them healthy, right? We fix the damage that occurs through the hallmarks of aging before it leads to pathology. And there's overwhelming scientific evidence of this, especially in the last 10 years. So to put it another way, typically your health will increase up until the age of say 30 or so, and then you'll have this steady decline in which you become less functional. You have cognitive decline, and then of course you'll die of one of those age-related diseases. So the idea is that we're keeping people at that peak state. We're keeping people biologically 30 or 20 for a much longer period of time. Longevity, by the way, is just a byproduct of health. If you keep someone healthy, as in biologically 30, they will live longer, in the same way that if you maintain a car well, it will just last longer. So you don't even have to think of longevity as the goal. It's just if we have better medicine in which we're intervening earlier, before that huge amount of damage accumulates that results in like these age-related diseases, then people will just live longer and healthier, and you will have saved like huge amounts of QALYs. So just to contrast anti-aging with current medicine, geriatric medicine. So typically at the moment, between the age of say 20 or 65, obviously this differs individual to individual, but you have subclinical aging, which means your body is aging, but it hasn't got to a point where it's severely interfering with your life. And at the moment, we just wait until someone gets the age-related disease and then we intervene. But with anti-aging, what we're thinking about doing is intervening during the subclinical aging phase. So, you know, someone might be 30 and perfectly healthy, but they've still aged relative to the age to when they were 20. So it's about fixing that damage that occurred during that period, reversing that damage, slowing the rate of damage before they actually get the clinical diagnosis of an age-related disease that they will otherwise, you know, die of and will have a severe impact upon their life. So just to kind of name drop a few promising therapies that are being developed, senolytics are kind of one of the most promising and one of the most exciting aspects of the field. These are drugs that kill senescent cells and they extend healthy lifespan in mice by up to 30%. mTOR inhibitors such as rapamycin, they also extend lifespan by about 20% in mice, and they're being put through clinical trials. Blood plasma exchange. This is where you basically filter out all the harmful proteins and metabolites in the blood and kind of replace it with neutral plasma. And that's shown to have very beneficial health span extension effects in mice. NAD boosters, which basically boost this key molecule called NAD+, which is very central in a lot of energetic signaling pathways. And that also helps to improve mitochondrial function. And epigenetic reprogramming, which has gained a lot of hype in the last 2 years because David Sinclair, this Harvard professor, published a paper in Nature, which is the world's #1 scientific journal, showing that they could restore sight in blind mice by basically reprogramming the cells of their optic nerve to basically regrow their optic nerve and restore sight. So all of these are kind of just a few examples of some of the promising anti-aging therapies, just to show you that this is not hypothetical, this is real science, and it's just, although we haven't got hard data in humans that it can slow aging, because obviously the trials take a while for obvious reasons, this is real science and it's being developed. Now, this kind of alludes to something I said earlier, but you can see that the reason slowing aging is so good and so important is because if you were to cure cancer, as I said, you only recover, say, 2, maybe 3 years of healthy life expectancy. But if you slow aging, even by a fraction of that, which we've achieved in, say, mice, you have a much greater extension of healthy life extension, right? An extension of healthy life, rather. So it's clear from a bang for buck perspective that intervening earlier before the problem gets really bad is the way to go. Now, the good thing is that recently, especially this year, anti-aging has received a lot of media coverage. So you can look up all these articles, The Guardian, Do We Have to Age? The Economist, Aging Can Be Cured, and in part it soon will be. Bloomberg, Meet the Scientists Trying to Reverse Aging. New York Times, Looking Forward to Your 170th Birthday. So there have been, you can Google all these articles, there has been a lot of recent media focus on anti-aging, which is good. But nevertheless, the field in terms of the scientific research remains underfunded. And so there is a funding gap that I think EA can potentially fulfill. So that brings me on to aging and EA. So geroscience is quite a neglected field. Although there's quite a lot of money in biomedical research in general. For example, in the US, the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, which is the largest kind of financing body of biomedical research, has a budget of around 45 billion. But the amount directed towards aging research, although the NIA, the National Institutes on Aging, receives about 3 to 3.5 billion, research to actually modulate and basically understand on a basic biology level and try and treat the aging process only receives about 100 million. And so that's quite small relative to how much is needed to progress the field, or how much could be going towards that, toward this really crucial area of research. And as we saw before, given that managing Alzheimer's costs 1 trillion per year, I mean, which is, what's that, 10,000 times more, it makes sense to invest a lot more into prevention, right? Into trying to solve the problem at the root cause, rather than manage the symptoms of aging, which are these diseases like Alzheimer's, which was something that I focused on a lot in my studies at Oxford in clinical neuroscience. And incidentally, that's how I got interested in the field, because you see all these patients with diseases like Alzheimer's, and rather than just allowing this process to happen to all of us, why don't we try and actually fix the problem at the root cause, which is the aging. So here's just an analogy, right? Like this, or an example rather. Look how many cancer charities there are in the UK. There's so much emphasis on the diseases of aging versus aging itself. How many charities are there for actually targeting aging? Like 2, right? SENS and Longevity Research Institute. There might be some others that I'm not aware of, but my point here is that society has missed the point. Society focuses on the disease of aging, but not the actual thing that's causing those processes. And even if all of these cancer charities succeed and we cure cancer, yay, we only get 2 years of healthy lifespan, whereas we could get like 30 years plus if we actually slow the aging process. So you can see that, you know, there's an epistemic competence issue within society where we've largely drawn all our attention to the disease of aging rather than think about what's the root cause. And by far the largest risk factor for all these diseases, as we saw from those exponential graphs, is aging. And if you take away aging, the rates of cancer in the population are up to, you know, thousands of fold lower because of how big a risk factor aging is. Now, onto the important stuff from an EA perspective. So from an EA perspective, all we care about is what is the most effective thing you can do, right? So currently the gold standard is GiveWell, okay? $5,000 to save one person's life in Africa for using a malaria bed net or, you know, through other interventions. So the thing is that if anti-aging can't compare with that, then we don't care about it from an EA perspective. But some initial calculations, and this is definitely an area that warrants more research, suggests that it could be the case that $2.50 donated to SENS, depending on how you model like donations to SENS and how it affects the aging field and how much sooner the anti-aging therapies enter the world, and et cetera, it could be that SENS is potentially 25,000 times better bang for buck in terms of saving lives than GiveWell, okay? So at the very least, I think it warrants a lot more investigation. But you know, I think open fill, if we're trying to like diversify and like de-risk our impact, I think it definitely is worth at the very least doing more investigation into this kind of cost impact kind of estimates, or, you know, just donating to SENS. So, you know, OpenPhil have actually evaluated anti-aging, and you can read their report. But several of us who are both EAs and interested in longevity, we feel that the report that they wrote and the kind of research they conducted was quite misguided and quite like it lacked comprehensiveness, and it lacked a lot of areas. So they didn't conduct an actual cause area, like a cause area impact estimate, which is I think probably the primary concern. They made arguments about how other areas of biotech will fill the gaps without demonstrating a nuanced understanding of the fact that like there is this opportunity. There are areas that are highly neglected and that they do seem to be crucial for the progression of the field. And they did not successfully identify key bottlenecks. Like they didn't seem to differentiate neuroscience research funding versus, you know, spinning out companies and like the funding that is available for the development of technologies once they have been discovered in the lab. And also they were generally pessimistic about the field without acknowledging the kind of medium-term benefits, right? So they were looking at things from like direct, like short-termist kind of perspective, but not realizing that on a medium-term perspective, it could be much higher impact, right? So there are a number of kind of issues with OpenPhil's report on anti-aging. Yeah, so you might say, isn't biotech already focused on anti-aging? And although there are a lot of biotech companies interested in this area and working on it, that's not the key bottleneck. The key bottleneck is just the research that results in these companies being spun out from these academic labs, given that a lot of the key research is coming from a handful of labs. If you're interested, if you want to read about the current biotech companies, there's over 150 longevity biotech companies. You can go to this handy website, which is agingbiotech.info/companies, and you can read about all these different companies. So there's also a bunch of common philosophical objections that come up: overpopulation, immortal dictators, social inequality, death brings meaning to life. These don't tend to come up too much in EA discussions because most of them are fairly easy to refute. We can go into them if you're interested. Some of the more, like, I think, valid EA objections come down to what's the impact on the long-term future. But on the 80,000 hours website, they say a few things that like some people who are EAs and into longevity, like myself and others, think are a bit kind of unjustified, in that they kind of say that there could be potentially negative impacts on the long-term future, but there's very little evidence for that. Like, the fact is, we don't know. So it could be positive. I mean, I suspect that if people are living healthier for longer now, that's going to be good for the long-term future for a number of reasons. Increased cognition, so we can make better decisions. You've got people living longer, so they're more invested in the future, and several reasons. So I would suspect intuitively that it would be good for the long-term future, but the fact is that no one's actually done this research. So part of this presentation is to argue that there needs to be more social sciences research into evaluating the potential long-term effects of anti-aging, right? Because if we find that there's likely to be a lot of beneficial long-term impacts of anti-aging, then I think we should definitely invest a lot more within the EA community. So on a psychological level and kind of an epistemic level, why does EA not focus that much on anti-aging? I think there's a number of reasons. I think one of the major reasons is because EA is primarily divided into short-term and like long-term kind of cause areas. And anti-aging is kind of in this middle ground where it's not like long-term future, but it's not like immediate, like donating to AMF. So that's why I feel like it's a bit different in terms of how we evaluate it. And I think like some of the nuances of where the benefits come from with anti-aging have been potentially missed within EA. Some EAs may be skeptical of the scientific feasibility of anti-aging because they're not in the field, or they're not biomedical researchers in the field. Or another common thing is they may be unaware that anti-aging research is underfunded. Again, because they may look at a company like Calico, which is spun out from Google, and they've got like a billion plus dollar budget, and they're working on aging. So you may think, oh, how can aging research be underfunded? But when you start grappling with the field a lot more, and you see the subtleties of, what is the actual research output of Calico, which labs are actually progressing the field, how much funding do they have, etc., you see that there's a huge need for more funding of the research. And maybe because some EAs feel like they're concerned about like some of the political, social, ethical, long-term implications. So to summarize, I think aging research is potentially one of the most important EA cause areas. I think it's quite overlooked. And at the very least, I think more research into the costs and benefits of aging research should be pursued. If not, more donations from organizations like OpenPhil to increase the research budget of SENS from like say 5 million to like 10 million or 5 million to 50 million. And just as a plug, recently we started this project, and most of our team are EAs, which is Longevity Wiki, where basically we're trying to improve epistemic competence and sense making in the longevity space. The website is longevitywiki.org. We plan to launch in 10 weeks or so. And we're just trying to create like some informative content and like a comprehensive wiki like open access wiki to basically explain the science and to create like an objective kind of resource that you can go to learn about this sort of area. So yeah, that's the talk. More than happy to take questions, and hope you enjoyed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jack. Super interesting. And yeah, it's really incredible just the amount of opportunity there is and how underfunded and neglected longevity is. If you do have questions, you could put them in the chat. I have one question, which is kind of one of the first questions that people tend to ask in this space, which is, what are you doing? What therapeutics are you taking? Are you like, taking metformin or rapamycin or any of the drugs that you had talked about? Like, what are some of the things that you're doing personally to intervene in your own lifespan?
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to ask that to. I definitely know in an ideal world what I could be doing. I mean, for me, it also, so what I do isn't necessarily going to apply to other people, because your risk tolerances should change over time. Like if I was in my 60s now or 70s versus being in my 20s now has a big impact upon my decision making, right? So because I'm young, I can afford to be a bit more risk, like a bit more conservative and not have to experiment as much and allow more time for the de-risking to be done. because some of these therapies have very promising data, but when we get results from human trials in the next 5 to 10 years, then we have even better understanding and better idea of like what's going to work and what doesn't. But what I do is just try and live a generally healthy lifestyle as much as possible. There are definitely some supplements that I think are very likely to have a good effect. And I know some of my colleagues who know a lot more about this space than I do take, like, Fisetin or metformin or what else? There's a huge PDF that I can send of a bunch of stuff that's likely to be good, like definitely, vitamin D, omega-3, fish oils. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff that can be taken that has a lot of evidence behind it. And that's also what we're talking about with what we're describing on the wiki is we're basically creating a database of, the scientific evidence for all these compounds, and ultimately trying to, have a resource for people to kind of learn about this sort of stuff.
Awesome.
For me personally, I'm more interested in it from a scientific perspective rather than a personal longevity perspective, I'd say.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. We had one question, which was you showed charts illustrating the association between age and risk, which is intuitive, but is there a way to distinguish correlation from causation?
I assume it's this graph. Let me just, yeah. Well, if it's not aging, what else is the magic factor that leads to increased risk? I mean, so aging, so the thing is, I guess what will help to explain this is if I went more into like the biology of, like, for example, how senescent cells results in cancer, and how, chronic inflammation increases diabetes and heart disease. But like a lot of the causal mechanisms have been very strongly kind of elucidated. So I can link papers if you want on that. But basically, we know that like when you get older, basically your body degenerates in multiple ways that can be classed in these hallmarks of aging. And all of these are linked to, these diseases of age. So to talk about my specialty, which is the neuroscience part of it. So as you age, you have more senescent cells in your central nervous system. This creates inflammation. You have all of these kind of inflammatory factors circulating in your bloodstream. And ultimately this results in like neuronal cell death, which results in, basically the cognitive decline and the kind of clinical symptoms of like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, as well as the reduction in mitochondrial function is also a key element of that decline. So it's definitely not, I mean, we know that basically aging is driving all these diseases. It's just kind of like this graph. I can understand what you would like. I think I understand the thrust of your question based on this graph alone, but like in the context of what we know in biomedical science, yeah, we know that aging is driving all these conditions.
Awesome. All right. One more question about this was, can you summarize the rebuttal to the overpopulation critique?
Yeah, sure. So, okay, so there's a few ways to answer this. But I think the fastest way I can explain it is, would it be ethical for us to permit COVID deaths because it would reduce carbon emissions? Because that's basically the same ethical question. It's like, should we limit the population's lifespan in order to reduce emissions? And I think, probably we do. Like, the thing is that we do need to take action on climate change, but the way to do it is not by letting people die of aging. The way to do it is through like innovation and through, new policies and through all these kinds of interventions. And but besides that, underpopulation is likely to be a bigger issue. If you look at demographic, I didn't include this data, but like if you look at demographic models, like by the WHO and so on, population's going to peak at like 9 to 12 billion by 2050 to 2100, and then come down. That's like the status quo. Now, the population will increase with anti-aging, obviously, because people are dying at a much lower rate. But actually, due to kind of the demographics and the demographic transition model, because birth rates are beginning to fall in much of Europe, and will be falling in Southeast Asia and Africa once they reach a certain level of development, then the population size isn't actually, the increase in population size globally isn't as sharp as people think. And even if it was, it would be kind of like ethically abhorrent to allow deaths for the sake of reducing emissions, in the same way that today it would be ethically abhorrent to deny someone a COVID treatment because on the basis that it would reduce their carbon emissions. There's a lot more detail to it, and it's definitely not a I mean, like it's not to deny that you know, population size is a multiplicative factor in consumption. It's more just to say that there are other kind of variables that are more important that we kind of toggle. And another thing is that, you know, if we think about like consumption, you know, there's 100-fold differences between countries. Like the US has a CO2 emission per capita that's something like 100 to 200 times that of Africa. Now, we're not saying, and even Portugal, which has equivalent living standards in the US, has like less than 1/4 of the CO2 emissions per capita as the US. So like, there's definitely ways to, you know, we don't have to like basically kill people to reduce our carbon emissions. There are other ways to do it.
Yeah, hang on. Let me respond to that. I asked the overpopulation question. I understand there's, you know, for at least a century, there's been lots of what I would call poorly founded concerns about overpopulation that don't factor in, you know, the demographic transition and so on. I mean, I understand it's a complicated issue, but there is a very basic element here. If you're able to reduce your death rate below your voluntary reproduction rate, then you will have exponential growth. Yeah. That's like very simple math. So, is the future of our species compatible with exponential growth? It seems to me if we don't die involuntarily, logically we would reach a point where we would either have to really get that, you know, travel into space thing going, or we would have to introduce involuntary death, which is not necessarily a great alternative. So that, you know, I don't really buy your COVID analogy.
Sorry. Yeah, that's a valid point. That's been raised before as well. So yeah, you're talking about like, you know, once we achieve like full negligible senescence in which like no one's dying, and, you know, if birth rates remain, you know, net positive, then yeah, we will have exponential growth. Yeah. So to respond to that, I mean, one simple policy would be, you know, use these like you can either like have kids or use these therapies, would be like a simple way to solve that, right? Now, from a moral standpoint, maybe that's questionable, but the thing is that like that would solve that problem. The thing is that also like the carrying capacity of Earth is potentially much larger than than 7 billion alive today. So it wouldn't be a problem for a while. So basically what I'm saying is we potentially have hundreds of years to solve this problem. And I don't think it's a reason for us to just have like 100,000 people dying per day, right? Based on this problem that may not even become a problem, because if we look at birth rates and how they're declining with increased technological kind of progress, then yeah, it could be that population remains stagnant. Because keep in mind that solving aging doesn't stop death. It just extends like healthy lifespan to you know, 1,000 years, or like you know, or something of that nature. So it's not like people won't die. It's just that you've gotten rid of the largest cause of death, and because birth rates are declining, then yeah, it's definitely conceivable that you know, there's multiple ways out of that, and probably, you know, if it was like it's very hard to forecast, but like if the population was getting so large that like people's living standards were drastically reducing, like probably there would be a lot of like, you know, just societal sentiment to like have less kids potentially, or have kids less frequently. I mean, keep in mind that, you know, with anti-aging, you can have kids when you're like 500 years old. So, you know, there's a lot of factors. But I think that those factors aren't really the main problem now. I think those are things that can be kind of figured out in the future, but it's not like the main kind of problem now, I'd say.
All right, nice. Our next question is two parts. Why are biological young people like David Sinclair the way they are, i.e. what accounts for variability? And the part 2 of the question is, lab mice live for 2 or 3 years. Are there any demonstrated life extension in, is there any demonstrated life extension in long-lived species? So why do long-lived species like whales, like what happens to them? Like what's the deal? Like what's the disparity there between short-lived and long-lived species?
Yeah, great question. So, okay, so there's a ton of factors that determine a person's rate of biological aging. So obviously, and some of them have been quantified using epigenetic aging clocks, such as the Horvath's clock. So definitely things like exercising helps to slow your aging and attenuate the hallmarks of aging, like reduce cellular senescence, improve mitochondrial function, etc. Smoking accelerates your aging, obesity accelerates your aging. You know, like depression or mental illness accelerate aging. You know, things like meditation attenuate aging. So there's a lot of factors in that have been like elucidated. There's also a lot of other psychosocial factors. So like, you know, air quality, social ties, like perceived social support. So I mean, it's a very complex like biopsychosocial interaction between the environment and you. Everything from the food you eat, your emotional fluctuations during the day, your sleep quality, you know, there's so many different factors. And there are a lot of like non-pharmaceutical ways to slow aging, right? Like if you're sleeping poorly, you know, if you sleep better, or if you're eating a poor diet, if you eat a better diet, or if you're not exercising, if you exercise, there's definitely a lot of ways to intervene with lifestyle. But the thing is, obviously that's limited, right? Because even if you have perfect lifestyle factors, you're still going to age and die without the therapies, which is why the therapies are needed to kind of like provide a greater benefit. As to your second question, the answer is yes. In terms of calorie restriction, so there's quite a lot of data from primates, so like monkeys and other primate species that I can't recall the name of, I think bonobos, or another primate species, where they have demonstrated that calorie restriction extends their healthy lifespan. And that's also part of the rationale for these drugs like metformin and rapamycin, which can be thought of as calorie restriction mimetics. So they're basically, because calorie restriction is quite an unpleasant thing, so as humans, it's quite challenging for us to restrict our calories on a chronic basis, like to basically eat 30% less calories per day. That's why we have these drugs like metformin and rapamycin that can give us the benefit of restricting our calories without actually having to do it. So yeah, the answer is yes. Why do certain whales overcome metabolic damage? Yeah, so other species can live a lot longer, like some whale and shark species can live like 200, 300, 400 years old. I don't actually know some of the specifics of their, I do know that there is research on that by Joao Pedro and his laboratory at University of Liverpool, but yeah, they have different like damage repair mechanisms, ranging from like DNA repair to other forms of basically like better machinery that they can use to repair some of their damage in their on their hallmarks. But yeah, I can't, off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you what those are.
That makes sense. Our next question is from Nirav. How optimistic do you think the 25,000x estimate versus GiveWell is? Is that a max or a midpoint estimate?
That at the moment is a very ballpark figure, but the what we're trying to do at the moment is actually get some expertise on board to help us create like the most accurate model we can. OpenPhil are generally interested in kind of like worst case scenario or like most conservative estimates. So that's what we're trying to aim for. So yeah, if anyone has that expertise and wants to help us build a model, and maybe if you have some modeling experience, feel free to help us, because we do want to have like a valid kind of estimate of the impact, and we think that it's a worthwhile project. So that's what we're kind of currently working on. That's an estimate that like SENS has given and has been verified by people like Emmanuel Ascani, who's written a post on Less Wrong. No, I think it's on EA Forum. It's called Evaluating Aging Research Part 1. So he's built a whole mathematical model to evaluate it. So you can read his post if you're interested in that. But yeah, it seems like a reasonable estimate.
Nice.
But beyond that, I couldn't say if it's you know, a min or max or anything.
Next question. Do you think there is value to non-scientific aging interventions such as lifestyle change campaigns and such. How do lifestyle interventions stack up against scientific interventions in terms of increased life expectancy at present?
Yeah, so I mean, for the time being, until we have like some good data on this, definitely, you know, eating healthy, exercising, sleeping well is worth doing. But there is preliminary evidence that a lot of the anti-aging interventions can stack, right? So there's some evidence from at Harvard University, George Church's laboratory, where they modulated a few different genes, and they found that the benefit in the mice, like the benefit of modulating these genes actually stacked. So it's like this gene gives you like 5% extra life, this one gives you like another 10%, this one gives you 10%. So there is some like rationale and some basis for thinking that there is likely to be kind of a compounding benefit of different therapies. So for example, you could take senolytics to kill your senescent cells. They might give you some life expectancy. You might take NAD+, like David Sinclair does, to boost your mitochondrial function. And because you're targeting like multiple of the hallmarks, it's likely that you're going to get some synergistic effects that could add on to one another. As to how they stack up, it's unclear at this point. You know, if you take a senolytic drug every day at the optimal, like biomarker optimized dose, it's not exactly clear how much life extension that'll give in humans. At a guess, I'd say, you know, maybe with all of the best anti-aging therapies from a young age of like 20 that are biomarker optimized, you could probably make someone live like at least 10 years older, I would suspect. But keep in mind that the field is quite young, and you know, the technologies that exist now in the last 5 years didn't exist before that. Like senolytics are only 5 years old, so a lot of these therapies are quite new, and the therapies that we're going to develop in the next 5, 10, 15 years could potentially have a much greater impact than what we currently have. And that's why it's kind of unknown unknowns, but there's no physical reason why we can't solve aging. So we may as well just keep, you know, investing in the research and trying to develop the therapies.
All right, and our last question, also from Jacob, and a corollary to the overpopulation. Given that, as you said, the world is getting much older and wealthier and more educated, it's surprising to me that effective altruism is needed to get funding for this. I just think that effective selfishness would provide people with enough motivation.
Yep. Yeah, you would think so. I mean, if you're a billionaire, but you're like, you know, you're going to die soon, you'd think that it's pretty good motivation to donate. But fact is that geroscience remains underfunded. So that's sort of the way it is. And keep in mind that regardless of, like, it's all about marginal impact, right? So even if like the field got more funding, if the marginal impact still suggests that it's like 25,000 times give well, then it's still worth donating, right? So it's worth keeping that in mind as well. I think the thing is that like a lot of like billionaires and like you know, kind of biotech VCs are investing in developing the technologies, bringing them through clinical trials, etc. So that's not as big of a bottleneck, but one of the key bottlenecks is just the research, right? Like research is very slow at the moment. Why is it slow? Because we have 100 laboratories in the world working on aging rather than like 1,000 or, you know, 10,000. So naturally, if you have 100 laboratories, the rate of research is going to be a lot slower. So why government's not funding this research as much as other fields like cancer? Because the public doesn't know that aging is what's driving cancer. People think that you just remain healthy and then, oh, one day you got cancer. You know, they're not aware that your rate exponentially increases. And that's why in the field, there's a lot of advocacy efforts by scientists, because scientists want to get the word out. Like, guys, like, you know, we need to start targeting the aging process. Alzheimer's doesn't come out of nowhere, right? You don't just wake up and, you know, get Alzheimer's. It's this slow process, this chronic process that accumulates over time. And that's why nowadays we have biomarker, like blood-based diagnostics, where we can diagnose Alzheimer's 20 years in advance, because we can look at the kind of precursors, which are kind of synonymous with the aging biomarkers that lead to Alzheimer's disease, right? So what do we do? Do we just allow the Alzheimer's to occur, or are we going to start intervening earlier and earlier to try and slow that rate of damage? Unfortunately, the education on geroscience amongst the public is very, very low. And that's why there's limited funding towards geroscience. And that's why we've created Longevity Wiki, And we've had over 15 EAs join our team over the past month as content writers. So if anyone's interested, you can jump over to longevitywiki.org, and we have a volunteer page, and it explains all the different roles we have available. Because a lot of EAs realize that, like, a lot of people don't know about this topic, and it seems pretty important. So that's why we're getting a lot of people joining Longevity Wiki as content writers. But yeah, it's just an unfortunate state of the world that it's kind of still neglected.
Yeah, well, I wish you luck with Longevity Wiki. I think it's an amazing project. I'm really excited that you're pursuing it. And thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with us. Of course, if you have any other questions for Jack, you can either message them in the chat and we could stay on. I don't know, Jack, if you have to hop off, but I'm going to end the recording now. And if you want to come to other Effective Altruism NYC events, you could go to effectivealtruism.nyc and stay involved.